Welcome to episode 1 of the Subjective Professor podcast. In this episode, we are going to discuss subjectivity. In the introduction, if you haven't listened to the introductory video, I highly encourage you to do so, where we go over some of the ground rules of this podcast. But we will talk about subjectivity today. I'm going to share my screen with you to show you my definition of subjectivity. It's the perspective of the one who is observing or thinking, critiquing, the person who's about to make a choice, the person who's listening to a podcast. It's that person's point of view. In other words, when I make this podcast, I'm doing so with my own subjectivity. You are listening to this podcast from your subjectivity. We may agree on various points. However, it does not mean that we have the same subjective point of view. And the reason is because what goes into the creation of our own personal subjectivity are all of our life experiences, the education that we received, the things that our parents told us, the things that we can remember or even maybe don't remember from our childhood. All of those experiences, all of that information, all of that knowledge contributes to form the subjectivity that you have right now, the one that you are using to interact with the world around you. So everyone has subjectivity. And everyone's subjectivity is going to be unique. And this is why it's so very important for us to open the lines of communication, something that I got into in the previous episode, right? Because we want to be able to have access to as much information as possible, even if we don't like it, even if initially we don't agree with it. It probably is not a bad thing to at least have access to it. Now, with our point of view, with our subjectivity, what are we going to do? We're going to observe objects. So interestingly, I subjectively produce this podcast, but when you listen to the podcast, it now becomes an object that you are now going to study. And so objects are just simply things that we observe. And it can be other subjects that we're going to be observing, but it's going to be from our own subjectivity. So part of the collection of objects that we're going to observe, it includes ideas, concepts that people have generated, ideas that other people have created and shared with other people. Those become objects, theoretical objects, that we are going to try to make a decision on using our own subjectivity. Now, the interesting thing is that science, because of the rise of science in this world that we have today, a lot of people believe that being objective is actually possible. But we have to realize that, in other words, when people say you're being objective, people imply that there is no subjectivity, that there is no bias, that you're being neutral in your observations and the decisions that you're going to make. You're being objective. And by emphasizing this objectivity aspect of this dynamic, you're ignoring the existence of the subject. And that actually becomes a problem. I'll illustrate what I mean by this by sharing my screen once again. And I share this object with all of my classes. And so some of you may recognize it, but let's just pretend we're in a religion class. And I say, we're going to study this object today. And I show you this object, and the kinds of questions that we may discuss or entertain in this religion class would be questions like, what does it mean? What did it symbolize? What did people do? What was the role of this object in the everyday lives of people? Was it something that they only thought about on the weekends? Was it something that they woke up to in the morning? Did they sacrifice things to it, right? These are the kinds of things that we may ask in a religion class when we are observing an object such as this. Now let's just pretend we change gears. We're all now in a physics class, and the physics professor walks in and says, we're going to study this object, okay? So what are the questions that we're going to ask about this object in a physics class? And so in a physics class, we're not going to ask questions like, what does it mean? We're going to say, how high is it? How wide is it? How dense is it? What's the material used to make it, right? These are the kinds of questions that we're going to ask in a physics class. Now, if you notice, the questions are completely different, even though we are studying the same object. And so what's my point? The point is that when we go to a university or when we receive a so-called education, what's really happening is that people are learning the proper subjectivity, right? If you learn how to look at objects in the correct way, you're being objective. But if you think about it, that's not actually what's going on. It's what we call objective today is just simply the approved subjectivity. So all other subjectivities are inferior and you have to use this one, right? So when it comes to studying religion, this is the way you have to do it. And if you don't do it this way, yeah, you're probably not a scholar. And then if we look at physics, they say, well, this is the way you got to do it. And if you don't do it this way, then you're probably not a science major, right? And so this is the kind of sort of situation that we can easily observe once you start looking at things this way. I'll just insert right here. That's not to say that the methods that people are teaching today are horrible. I'm not saying that either. What I am saying is we should always allow the possibility of improving on what already exists, and maybe having multiple perspectives, multiple ways of studying something to generate better information. Now, let's just say every single department in the university, even public health, will study this object and try to come to a conclusion about this object. And we take all of that information and we put it together in a book, right? All of that information that we have now collected about this object, right? And we read it. First of all, from each department, if we were to read it, one at a time, how long would it take for people to realize that we're all talking about the same object? That would be something kind of interesting. Maybe I'll do that one day in the future, for people to, for how long it takes people to realize that they are all studying the same object based on the reports that are generated without pictures or diagrams about the object. That would be kind of interesting. But reading all of those different subjectivities would become closer to understanding what it is that we're observing. And probably not. This is a shadow sculpture, and it's a beautiful sculpture because the way you appreciate it is that you have to shine a light on it in a particular angle, and it will cast a shadow. And then you rotate the sculpture just a little bit, and it will cast a different shadow. And then once again, you rotate it a little bit more, and it'll cast a third shadow. So there are three distinct shadows created by a single sculpture. I have to give props to the artist. His name is John V. Muntian. And this particular work is called Singing in the Rain. He does do commissions and they're fantastic. So if you're interested, you really go check him out. But anyway, so just by simple observation doesn't necessarily get you closer to understanding whatever it is that you are observing. And so when we go to the university, yeah, sure, we're memorizing a lot of information. Some might argue memorizing to forget later, a lot of this information. But are we really understanding life? Are we really understanding society and the way the world works better than we did before? I would go so far as to say that perhaps we are being socialized into how to think. And to illustrate this, I will share my screen once again to sort of emphasize this, okay? So if we were to, oops. all of a sudden my fingers don't seem to want to work correctly. But let's just say I were to write a pattern like this and I asked you what the next number would be. Most people would say 4, and I would applaud you. Yes, that's very good. And if I were to write, okay, so what if I write a pattern like this? What would you say is the next number? And most of you would say this, and I would applaud you once again. And then if I said, what's the number, the next number in this pattern? And most of you would say this without even thinking, because I set you up to give me that answer. But if I told you that the right answer that I was expecting was this, some of you may say, oh, you were writing down prime numbers, right? But the point is that most of us will recognize this pattern. I've seen this pattern. I recognize the pattern, and usually the next number in the pattern is a 9, right? 3, 5, 7, 9. But if I were to say that the actual expected answer was 11, right? It sort of just, it throws people off initially, especially if you don't remember prime numbers, then you don't realize what it is. But what I'm trying to say is that, once again, this is just simply symbolic of what is going on. We see a part of the story and we say, oh, I've seen this story before. I know what comes next. It's this. And so what happens in school is people will say, when you see, this is racism. And so you got to do something about it. Without more information, how do you know? How do you know for sure? And most of us, we enjoy shortcuts. And so we say, oh, well, but I recognize the pattern. And so I'm going to jump to a conclusion, right? I don't need to hear more information. I already know what's going to happen next. And this is what happens next, right? And so because of the way education is happening today, people are learning how to jump to conclusions. We are socialized to think that we understand what we're observing. I would even go so far as to say that a lot of instructors, they'll say, whenever you see this, this is what you have to do. This is what you have to feel, right? So we're not only being socialized to interpret in a certain way, we're also being socialized to feel certain emotions, to react in a certain way. And this is what contributes to what we're observing all around us today, right? So we're not really learning information, ideas to interact, to debate, to discuss, to kick the tires, to see if there's something better, or if this really is, for now, at the moment, with what we know, the best choice that we can make. Instead, we're just jumping to a conclusion, expressing our emotions that we were taught to express, and then we think that this is education. Now, I know a lot of people usually get upset with me at this point, but if you're still listening, then you're going to say, well, okay, so what's the point? So the point is that whatever we think is truth is just simply truth because it's our perspective. So if you change your perspective even just a little bit, the truth will change. And I know a lot of people say, oh, this is that postmodernist stuff. Yeah, but there's a difference. A lot of other instructors, when they use postmodernist deconstruction, right, when they use deconstruction as a critique, they'll say, oh, the patriarchy is oppressive, blah, blah, blah. And so they will try to undermine it to get rid of it. But then they take the next bad step, which is they replace it with something that is equally subjective, right? So maybe the patriarchy is oppressive. Maybe it is not the best way of doing things. You know, it's a subjective decision, a subjective critique. But what I would say, the next step would be, so if you don't like it, don't do it, right? Give people the freedom to be able to explore and do something different. But a lot of other people, what they do is they replace it. They say, okay, don't do this, do that. And the problem is that you're replacing one subjective point of view with another, and then you're going to give that second subjective point of view authority, which is basically the same problem that we started with. And so to insist that this is the right way of doing it is just simply hypocritical. And if you remember from our introduction, that's one of the rules that we must not violate. You cannot use something that is hypocrisy as a solution. So the benefit of looking at, oh, I'm going to run a little bit long over my 15-minute mark, but anyway, so the benefit is that there is no truth. Everyone gets to be able to believe whatever it is that they want, their own personal truth. Now, you might say, well, then how do we have society? Well, part of taking the step to believe in something as true, you have to make a choice. And with that choice comes consequence, right? Not only is there a cost, but there is also consequence, which is actually part of the cost, but at this point, we'll just say separate the two. There's the initial cost, and then there's the consequence, okay? And so we will be guided by the consequences of the choices that we make. If by making a choice, the house that we created or built falls on itself, then we say, aha, this is probably not the best way of making a house. And so then you're going to do some more research, maybe find a better company to rely on. And so it's through this trial and error, which happens very, very quickly, that we begin to realize what is better than another way of doing things, okay? So it's not about right or wrong, it's about allowing people to make the choices that they feel is the best choice, and then having to live with the consequences. In other words, to take responsibility for the choices that they make. And once people start having to take responsibility for the choices that they make, then they have to quickly look for what are the best options. I'm going to leave it there, this episode, and I will see you in the next one.